When you think of the name Larry Hama and about ninjas, you'll likely think of G.I. Joe's Snake Eyes and even Storm Shadow, but in the words of Yoda, there is another. Another, in fact, so good he's dubbed the Ultimate Ninja. And he comes with a story that's both deeply personal and massive in scale, transcending both time and space. A story that was far ahead of its time and yet largely remains underappreciated. This is the story of Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja. Created by Larry Hama and artist Ron Wagner, Nth Man the Ultimate Ninja was created toward the end of the 1980s, at a time when Larry Hama was plotting his seminal work, his 155-issue run with Marvel Comics on G.I. Joe: A Real American Hero. This story was originally planned as a graphic novel, then was split into just over 20 chapters, but toward the end of the run, the title was plagued with low sales, and so Marvel asked Larry and Ron to basically just start wrapping it up. And they did, with 16 issues, having to condense the story down from 24 issues to 16. In one interview, Larry Hama had this to say about his story: "I wanted to do something really different, to combine mutants with realistic combat and science fiction. They went along with it, but it couldn't exist in the Marvel universe because it was a separate reality called the Rinse Cycle. And Marvel had no way to hype it or sell it within their structure, which is based on the interconnectivity of all their characters. That's a very good sales strategy, but limit your product." The first time we see the two main characters was in the anthology series Marvel Comics Presents, though Nth Man remains in its own separate reality. That story was a preview in Marvel Comics Presents issue 25, serving as an introduction to readers to this new tale of the Ultimate Ninja. MCP editor Terry Kavanagh says it was likely Larry's idea to preview Nth Man in Marvel Comics Presents. Now, that said, there was the 6th issue of the 2nd volume of the bi-monthly Comic Scene magazine in a piece by Patrick O'Neill called Nth Degrees and Nietzsche United Just for Fun. And in that article, where we get some art of Nth Man, Larry says, "This is really my little treatise on what a superhero is. The ethical dynamics of what we tend to blot out when we perceive a superhero," and then he dives into the overall plot of Nth Man. So when the book debuted, America and the Soviet Union, really the world, were still in the grip of Cold War and the threat of nuclear war and complete annihilation in the form of World War III. The premise with Nth Man from that perspective tells the story of a world that did move into a third world war, but not a nuclear war. This story moves into a global conventional war, and later biological one, after one of the main characters uses his telekinetic powers to deactivate the world's nuclear stockpiles. Larry also said, while laughing about it and acknowledging that it had been done before, there's a super telekinetic in this universe who can alter time and space, and he was taking it upon himself to make the world better for everyone. He gets rid of all the nuclear weapons. In fact, Alan Moore's Miracle Man, which came out that same year, had a similar plot arc with a superpowered person removing the world's collective nuclear arsenal. In another interview, Hama says, "I think it was my answer to Watchmen. I started with the premise of there actually being somebody with vast telekinetic powers and thought about what if that person was a geeky kid. That telekinetic, named Alfie Omegan, meant to be a reference to Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, is deemed too dangerous, and so the US intelligence apparatus had marked him as a target. In this world, superpowered beings are known as hyperhumans. They can only think of one man to stop him, an assassin, the Ultimate Ninja, the Nth Man, who just so happens to have grown up with Alfie at an orphanage in Iowa, not unlike Tetsuo and Kaneda from Akira, even bringing in the psycho and telekinetic elements, and which happened to come out right at the same time. And for those of you asking what nth means, there's a glossary in this series and it defines nth as extreme and utmost, as in to the nth degree. In the MCP 25 preview story, we begin this tale in central Iowa in the autumn of 1968 in a place called the Maryvale Home for Boys, run by the abusive Elmore Bigot and nurse Eudora Ann Gooch. Bigot threw John and Alfie in the attic in that story, telling them to suffer up there in the heat with no supper. The two overlords had actually killed another kid named Riley and covered it up by burning him in an annex building. And as they mentioned this, were disappointed that they didn't also burn John and Alfie alive with that Riley kid. It turns out that on February 3rd, 1959, a lady with third-degree burns over 90% of her body, clothing scorched only on the inside, dropped the two kids off at the home steps, and with no identification, they called her Jane Doe and her progeny John Doe. She told them one kid is bad and the other good, but which one? If that sounds familiar, it is. February 3rd, 1959 is the same day that Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper died in a plane crash in that same state of Iowa, a tragic incident that had come to be known as the day the music died. So up in the attic, Alfie used his powers to bring John and himself to look at the future, a power that he called could-be's. and they looked at a future where John was a CIA assassin in Moscow attempting a hit on Colonel Novikova, head of the KGB hit squad called Spetsburo. Future John let Captain Soloviev capture him, and the colonel ordered the captain to take him to Lubyanka prison. They then caught a glimpse of Alfie using his powers for nuclear disarmament, fashioning himself a future hero. In 1968, Alfie killed Tyrone Parrish, the son of the group home's dietitian. Tyrone had been in Vietnam with a CIA assassin named Dr. Irving Yagyu, DDS, a dentist, who went by the codename Painless. Not long after, Painless went to the orphanage to meet John and Alfie, and he recognized Alfie from his psychic abilities. Painless reported this to the Central Intelligence Agency, and they dispatched 2 agents to take Alfie away. Alfie was then adopted by the Omegan family, and the 2 were separated. But what no one knew at the time was this couple were those very same CIA agents. It wasn't long after this, though we see it via flashback in issue 8, that Huey, who was a bully at the orphanage, had stolen Alfie's comic book collection, which included the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man and a full run of Fantastic Four. Alfie used his powers to take over Director Bigot's body, and he dressed him like an evil, axe-wielding clown, and he forced him to attack Huey. John managed to save Huey, but the orphanage was burned down, and both Bigot and Nurse Gooch died in the flames. Then Painless ended up adopting little John Doe, and he cherished John, even giving him the nickname Peachy, someone he held dear after losing his biological son Timmy to a bout of pneumonia. The nickname Peachy comes from Peach Boy, the legend of a boy from Okayama Prefecture that would slay Oni. When John was 16 years old, Painless brought him to the CIA's skunk farm where Alfie was located. Alfie was distraught and acting out at this time after he learned that the Omegans had recently died. When Alfie saw John again after all that time, he calmed down. And Alfie used his powers again to do another could-be look at the future, and this is when they were confronted with the corpses of Bigot and Gooch. Gooch strangled John, choking the life right out of him right in front of Alfie and Yagyu. Yagyu had Alfie try to resurrect John, but he was only able to bring back Alfie's impression of John, not the actual John, though he did manage to retain a little bit of the actual John in this new iteration. Alfie was traumatized by this, blaming himself for causing it by doing the could-be and subsequently killing his friend, so he blocked his own memory of the incident, and he became comatose, and so Alfie remained in a vegetative state for an entire year. His first act when he reawoke was to cure every terminal case at the hospital by mentally altering their cellular structures. He then offered to help the world governments use his powers for good, but they refused, wanting to weaponize him. So his second act as a hyperhuman was about to begin. Meanwhile, Yagyu, aka Painless, had taken this new John Doe under his wing, fully aware that this was not the original John. But this new John, unlike the original, could kill, and it was this version of John Doe who became a lethal assassin, the ultimate ninja, and took on the codename Nth Man. In 1984, the could-be that we saw when they were kids came to fruition as John was sent to assassinate Colonel Novikova, and he ended up in Lubyanka prison. And it was around the same time that everybody woke up, and suddenly there were no more nukes in the world. They were all inert. But instead of world peace, this sent the world into global war. The Warsaw Pact forces had marched all the way to France where Paris was burning, but London was holding out even as those same troops moved toward the English Channel. The Scandinavians were fighting as partisans while Helsinki and Finland had fallen to American paratroops. America was backing China, who was pushing against the eastern front of Russia. There were Soviet airborne troops landing in Alaska and Canada, a la Red Dawn, and no one had heard from any of the countries in Central America. Nth Man's first issue debuted just 1 week after Marvel Comics presents issue 25, and we enter the story with our main character, John Doe, still kind of a mystery as most of this backstory we just talked about had yet to be revealed. And we meet John where he's already a prisoner at the Soviet Lubyanka prison. So 6 months into this world war, the CIA, led by Colonel Graydon, sent Painless and some US Navy SEALs and Green Berets to Moscow to break John out of jail. John heard the commotion topside and fought his jailers, taking them out with palm heel strikes and plates to the throat, his ruthless assassin skills on full display. Sergeant Levin was carrying John's katana, and she unsheathed it when they met up, giving him back his iconic blade. Only Painless John and Sergeant Deborah Levin, who's third-generation CIA, managed to make it out of Lubyanka alive, and they did so by using Novikova to get past the troops outside. When they got far enough, John tossed Novikova out of the car and she landed in a puddle, soon to face a firing squad for her failures. So he thought. Her loyalists pretended to shoot her, so she ended up escaping in a Hind E attack helicopter, pursued John and Yagyu, who'd commandeered a Russian BTR and had already saved some village children along the way. Alfie was watching them remotely from his secluded enclave in Antarctica near the North Pole. He was mad about what happened, mad at the world, mad at John, mad and jealous. John's crew continued battling their way through, evacuating the children to a charnel house that served as a Russian field hospital until it was bombed by attack planes and the kids were taken away on a Ka-25 Hormone helicopter. General Lem had ordered Soviet paratroopers to kill Novikova, but then he was shot in the temple by Captain Ivanovich. She escaped on that same helicopter, but was then dropped right in the path of General Feng and his advancing Chinese forces. Russia was now arming ballistic missiles on train cars that had chemical and biological warheads in a massive underground complex. They managed to mutate a ferociously virulent aerosol virus whose particles were small enough to penetrate filters and respirators and which was resistant to antibiotics. They had also developed a vaccine and distributed it to Soviet forces along with their flu shots. And then back with John's team, they were at a barn where Deb was hit by sniper fire and she went down. So Novikova, now referred to as Novi Cakes, along with John, struck back, John being so quick he could dodge bullets. Alfie showed up disguised as a clown and ended up sending them through a portal to escape, just as the barn they were in was surrounded and the barn was destroyed. What happened when they went through the portal was they swapped realities with Earth 616's X-Men Phoenix and Nightcrawler, and when they entered the rinse cycle, those two were met with a massive Galactus-sized and Galactus garb-wearing Alfie, while John and Novikova were met with Captain Britain and Megan. The Alfie Galactus proceeded to attack the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he knew of Galactus from the Fantastic Four comic books he used to read back at the orphanage. He took a moment to go watch Colonel Novikova and her, as he put it, creamy thighs. Inside the memorial, the Allies sent in Dr. Candy Goodstroke to talk him down. It was with help from Jamie Braddock, another reality warper and manipulator, that they got aid swapping back. And when they got back to Earth, they landed in Washington, D.C., and now with the new uniforms and weapons. Alfie used his clicker to temporarily change them to Moscow Maid and the spy guy of the classic Legion of Stupid Heroes. They were just in time for both the US and the USSR to launch those biological payloads at each other. John and Novikova went to talk with Giant Alfie, who sent them inside a video game where they had to battle digital monsters, pixelated ninjas called Necro Ninjas that were deadly to the touch, and they had to try to escape, and with enough time to stop those ICBMs. Alfie was able to neutralize most of the missiles, but instead of destroying them, had to send out little pixie versions of himself to render the warheads inert. And even with that effort, some still hit their targets, like Idaho, Florida, and Canada, with more than half striking mid-ocean or the Arctic tundra. There was, however, one airburst over Maryville Corners, Iowa, John's hometown. Alfie then said, "Why should I try to save an ungrateful humanity when I can bring peace and happiness to the whole universe?" So he decided to head to space. He even turned Dr. Goodstroke into his own herald, a female version of Silver Surfer that she thought made her look like a hood ornament. The Lincoln Memorial was Alfie's personal spaceship for this voyage. Around the same time, Nth Man was killing some Spetsnaz soldiers disguised as military police who were trying to recover Colonel Novicakes. And so as Alfie left Earth's atmosphere, he sent 2 pieces of himself to reanimate Nurse Gooch and Director Bigot and charged them with running the world until he got back. This was happening while Novi Cakes took John to a KGB safe house in Georgetown, where he was met with the infamous KGB Swallows, a group of sultry female assassins. The Swallows, who were there for logistical support for the Spetsnaz units deployed in Washington, D.C., tied John up. But that didn't last, as Yagi was landing in the city in a giant Russian bomber, which was just the distraction John needed to escape his bonds. And while this was happening, the Russian planes were bombing Andrews while Major Turtle Tompkins was attempting to get wheels up to help the bomber and fight back against the Russian planes in disguise over Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, John escaped with Novi Cakes in a 1954 Ferrari Testarossa. Using flares and a heavy foot on the gas, they led Yagu's bomber to land right on Pennsylvania Avenue. And it was then that Favara Novikova, John Doe made out, finally giving in to their attraction to each other, in a very Luke and Leia sort of way, which will make sense in a moment. While that was happening, Gooch and Bigot on Earth created an army of moots, people mutated by Alfie's virus, and they went to war against America and Russia, who'd now allied against this new threat, and with help from John and the Colonel and Painless, battled the moots for a whole year. They ended up finding Gooch and Bigot at Maryville in Iowa, now having turned the landscape into a post-apocalyptic wasteland like something out of Mad Max. Even John's old bully Huey was there, dressed like a methed-out version of Casey Jones from TMNT. They converged on Gooch and Bigot, but they slipped into the past to kill the original John Doe. That's when Alfie returned from space, being pursued by an immensely powerful cosmic being named Magubgub. It was a supermassive being, so big its body was 9 million light years across. The alien detected a temporal anomaly, and to eliminate that anomaly, it wanted to destroy Earth. Gooch and Bigot appeared again from back in time, saying it's not possible for him to be there, and that they had just gone back in time to 1974 and they killed him. This is when that plot twist from the past was revealed finally in issue 15. Alfie said he realized now how small his power was, how finite his being was. He didn't have the warrior spirit to fight the aliens, so he imbued John with powers, and John used his new powers to fight Magub, using the alien's own mass against him. John had a power to turn time and space inside out, and this collapsed the alien's mass in on itself. Magub then used his power to show John the truth about himself. That's when Nth Man realized he'd have to fix the temporal anomaly and close the time loop himself. So John took Alfie and Colonel Novikova with him back in time to when they were still infants, back to February 3rd, 1959. Novikova couldn't exist in two places at once, and she combusted. And as she died, she handed over the boys to Maryvale Orphanage, and then died, bringing us back to the beginning of the story. Nth Man remains a memorable, if not niche, character in the Marvel Universe, known for his deadly skills and his tragic backstory. Will we ever meet John Doe again? Well, we'll have to wait and see, which means that's a wrap on this one, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.